Hello, this is our lunch study break. It is November 10th, Wednesday, 2021, and it is the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht. And so what we are going to do today is discuss Kristallnacht. I see some of you are shaking your heads. That's great. I like that because we have created a space here where we can have challenging conversations and we can ask difficult questions. And a little bit of background about this session here is, growing up as a Jew on Long Island, who had baby boomer parents. So much of our education in Jewish day schools and in congregations was around Holocaust. Never forget. Listening to stories from survivors. And it was heavy-handed, I'll say, to a large extent. And I think as a result of that, I think I and a lot of my peers sort of bristled from it. And I find myself sort of drawn back to some of the lessons that the rabbis, when I was growing up, were sharing with me, and some of the lessons that the Shoah survivors had as our world becomes more divided and more chaotic than ever before. So it's been 83 years since Kristallnacht, November 9th, November 10th, 1938. And what I want to do today is see if we can understand Kristallnacht, see if we can have a conversation around it. I have videos that I'd like to show, and I have some documents that I would like to get into, and to see if we can understand what was going on in that society that led for an event like Kristallnacht to take place. What lessons can we glean maybe from our own recent history or from recent leaders in our own world in terms of the lessons that come from the survivors, or, are there lessons? So I just want to begin from there, and I'm going to start, and I'm going to take us through a little bit. Assume no knowledge here. I'm not going to assume any knowledge here, and I'll pause from time to time to see if we can have a little bit of a conversation here. And if anybody wants to contribute privately, you can just private direct message me. Okay, so I have a bunch of links that I am going to take everybody through here. And just by way of a little bit of background. So heads up, I'm not a PhD in history. All right, I am a rabbi, and I'll do my best to give the appropriate context. I'm not going to get into anything pretty much before the Nuremberg Laws. So this is just going to be, a superficial understanding of the events of 83 years ago. My best attempt for us to engage in a conversation. So Hitler comes to power, and almost immediately upon assuming the chancellorship in Germany, he begins promulgating legal actions against German Jews. In 1933, he proclaims a one-day boycott against Jewish shops. A law was passed against kosher butchering, and Jewish children began experiencing restrictions in public schools. All right, so then in 1935, we have the Nuremberg race laws. So in September 15th, 1935, the Nazi regime announced two new laws, the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor. These laws informally became known as the Nuremberg Laws or the Nuremberg race laws. And if I show you here, I have a little bit of documentation. So here it is from September 15th, 1935. Thoroughly convinced by the knowledge that the purity of German blood is essential for the further existence of the German people, and animated by the inflexible will to safeguard the German nation for the entire future, the Reichstag has resolved upon the following law unanimously, which is promulgated herewith. Section 1, marriages between Jews and nationals of German or kindred blood are now forbidden. Marriages concluded in defiance of this law are void, even if for the purposes of invading this law they are conducted abroad. Proceedings for annulment may be initiated by the public prosecutor. Relations outside marriage between Jews and nationals for German or kindred blood are forbidden. Jews will not be permitted to employ female nationals or Germans or kindred blood in their households. Jews are forbidden to hoist the flag and to present the colors of the Reich. On the other hand, they are permitted to present the Jewish colors. Right? So here a little bit, I'm not going to go through all the Nuremberg laws, but here you have from the Jewish Telegraph Agency from September 17th, 1935. Let me make this a little bit bigger. This is how it was reported in JTA. Beginning today, the Jews are no longer citizens of Germany. Today, in accordance with the new laws adopted last night by the Servile Reichstag, after a message from Hitler, the 500,000 Jews have become deprived of political rights, deprived of the right to display the flag, but permitted to display the blue and white Jewish flag. The new laws forbid Jews to employ Aryan women under 45 years of age as domestic servants and to intermarry. Violation of the laws will bring a maximum punishment of 1 year in prison. Okay, the provisions will regulate the employment of Jews, of female Aryan servants will become effective January 15th, 1936. Here's a quote here. Goring declared that it was God who created racial differences. We can reach internal freedom only through purity of race. Our girls must be protected by law against the Jewish race. Okay, so that brings us almost up to Kristallnacht. It's hard to believe. Such laws could have been enacted not that long ago. And I think one of the lessons that comes up for me is how challenging it is for us to recognize evil and to understand evil. And as we go through the instances that happened on Kristallnacht and we hear some of the testimonies, pay particular attention to the shock. This sort of, I mean, you might be reading these laws thinking, why would anybody stay? You couldn't, I mean, why would you stay at this point? But we know Jews did stay. And the question as to how could they stay? Does anybody have any thoughts around, how do you stay under this regime? Anybody have any thoughts? Sandy Edwards.
I'm sorry, I'm in my car. But they stayed because they considered themselves Germans, and they had fought, like my grandfather fought in World War I. He was wounded. They were Germans, and some of the Jews had worked in the German government with, that was part of the reason. They were established, they had businesses, yes. But in 1935, in my grandfather's town, there was a pogrom, basically. That was before Kristallnacht, and the kids were being harassed. My father and his sister were being harassed at school.
Lulia.
So they
When did they leave? When did they leave, Sandy?
They left in 1937, so it was before Kristallnacht. My other grandfather was picked up the morning after Kristallnacht on his way to Minion in Hamburg and sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. So he was, my grandmother was able to get him out before the war with a visa to leave the country. But you know, they were still Germans.
Thank you, Sandy. I have a testimony from a woman. It sounds very similar that I'm going to show in a little bit to everyone. Very similar story to the one of your families in terms of being picked up the next morning and being taken to a concentration camp and feeling, and well, I won't tip that story, but the feeling that you described is the one that is expressed by other survivors, which is they felt like good Germans. They had fought for they'd fought in the war for Germany. They were patriotic Germans. I think that's something maybe we can understand, maybe we can't understand. Maybe it depends on the generation you're from. Steve Miller, you've got your hand raised. Thank you.
Yes. A big reason why they didn't leave is no one wanted them. I think I told you this before. At that time, under the US law, the US would accept around 28,000 a year from Germany and Austria. We were only letting in around 3,000 to 4,000, in large part because the Roosevelt administration felt that these Jews coming in would take good jobs away from American Christians, and they didn't want that. So they made it as difficult as possible for Jews from Germany to come here. And that was especially true after Kristallnacht. So many wanted to leave then, and we refused.
And it should sensitize us to the plight of immigrants in our world today. Thank you, Steve. Meryl.
Yeah, I totally agree with Steve and Sandy. I think another point is that, and I was talking to a friend of mine who's a child of 2 Holocaust survivors, and she said people stayed, just as Sandy said, because it was their country, but also they couldn't imagine, they thought it was going to get better, that this was not going to last for very long. And she said, you know, we have the benefit of hindsight now, but who could have even thought from Kristallnacht to, 6 million Jews murdered and gassed and all the horrors? I mean, no human mind could even imagine that. So they thought it would blow over.
Yeah, I saw that you and I were looking at the same historical page on Kristallnacht.
Yeah, that's a great
one. I realized
one.
the two of us are really connected in an astonishing way, Mom. But I think that for me is the lesson that's the hardest one, is this idea of our inability to perceive evil. We just seem in a lot of ways incapable of recognizing it. Randy.
Yeah, hi. So just to give a little perspective on the events of those days, every Jewish kid my family also is from Germany at that time, in a small village in the country, and every Jewish boy at his bar mitzvah, the present that they got was a complete set of Goethe works, High German. So they so identified with themselves as being Germans that the bar mitzvah present were of that genre. So my grandfather, he also served in the German army and received a Bronze Star from the Nazi regime. And he was so convinced of his invulnerability that he didn't realize that the storm that was coming. In our little town, my grandfather was subject to a mini pogrom where he was marched through the streets of this small synagogue of this small town with a sign, "I am a Jewish pig," and that kind of perspective permeated the way our family dealt with the fact that we were very lucky. We were able to come over to the United States because we had a sponsor in New York, but the connection to Germany from the small town where people lived was unbelievably opaque. People just thought, like has been spoken earlier, that this will blow over, this will go away.
Yeah. Stuart, thank you, Randy. You're muted, Stuart.
Of course, the best example, I guess, is the ship, the St. Louis. In 937 Jewish refugees trying to flee Nazi persecution, and they tried to go to Havana, Cuba, May 27th, 1939. Only 28 were admitted, so they appealed to the United States and Canada, and the United States and Canada said no and turned them away, and they went back, and many survived, but others were not so lucky. And
So let me, that's right, Dad. So let me move ahead in time. Let us get to Kristallnacht here. So let us move ahead. So there's obviously there's upset and feelings, strong feelings about these Nuremberg laws. And then here's a report from the JTA, November 8, 1938. Polish Jewish youth, age 17, shoots Nazi embassy official in Paris. Race vengeance held motive. He was upset. The German embassy official was today shot and seriously wounded by a 17-year-old Polish Jew named Herschel Feivel Grinspan, in which the embassy said was an act of vengeance for the mass expulsion of Polish Jews from the Reich. The wounded official, Ernest Edward von Rath, 32, was young, was a third secretary of the German embassy and a nephew of the late German ambassador. Grinspan, a mild-looking youth speaking fluent French and German, appeared at the Reich embassy this morning and asked to see the ambassador's secretary to submit a document of considerable importance. Ushered into von Path's presence, the young man delivered a brief speech on Reich persecution of Polish Jews and then whipped out this tells you how little I know about guns, a 6.35 millimeter revolver and fired 2 bullets into the secretary's body. As von Rath slumped down unconscious, attendants rushed in and overpowered the assailant. Grinspan was immediately turned over to a French policeman. The would-be murderer, the German account said, seemed completely sane, but was filled with a desire to avenge his Polish co-religionists recently expelled from the Reich. Okay, good guy, bad guy? Good guy, bad guy, Grinspan? Anybody want to value judge the 17-year-old Grinspan? Probably not. He was fighting a war, wasn't he? He's a soldier in a war. Perhaps. Thoughts? Before we get to the German response to this, I'll show you how the Germans responded to this. The response to this leads directly to Kristallnacht. So, hold on, we covered that already. Here is the Nazi telegram, and it had instructions for Kristallnacht for November 10th, 1938. So a translation of the telegram sent from Reinhard Heydrich, Major General of the SS, on November 10th, 83 years ago, that instructed local German officers on how to carry out the anti-Jewish measures that became known as Kristallnacht. Secret. Copy of most urgent telegram from Munich on November 10th, 1938, 1:20 a.m. to all headquarters and stations. Urgent for immediate attention. Measures against the Jews tonight. Because of the assassination of Secretary von Rath in Paris, demonstrations throughout the Reich are expected tonight, November 9th and 10th. Here are the following orders. 1, upon receipt of this telegram, the chiefs of the political police, the Gestapo stations, where their deputies must immediately contact the appropriate political authorities, the Nazi leaders, by telephone to arrange a discussion about the conduct of the demonstrations. This discussion should include the competent inspector or commandant. Only such actions may be carried out which do not threaten German lives or properties. Burning of synagogues only when there is no threat of fire to the surroundings. Let me read that again. The local political authorities are informed that the German police have received from the SS and the chief of the German police the following orders. You can only carry out actions that do not threaten German lives. So you can burn synagogues when there is no fire to the surrounding, threat of fire to the surrounding. Stores and residences of Jews may only be destroyed, but not looted. The police are instructed to supervise compliance with this order and arrest the looters. Special care is to be taken on commercial streets, that non-Jewish businesses are completely secured against damages. Foreign citizens, even if they are Jewish, may not be molested. All right, so basically there is this understanding that the police are to let it go. And I want to share a testimony from Yad Vashem here. Hold on one second. Let me share this. It's in Hebrew, but there will be English subtitles. Oh, hold on. I wanted to share this the right way.
ליל הבדולח הייתי בברלין, שוב פעם אבא שלי. הלכנו בקורפרסנדם, שוב פעם, מהומות, באמת הפעם שברו כל מה שרק אפשר, בדולח, זה זכוכית. הכל, כל העיר נשמע שזכוכית נופלת ונשברת, בכל הרובעים. והגענו לבית הכנסת, שבו נהייתי בר מצווה. ועמדנו שם על שתי בלטות ממול לבית הכנסת, וראינו איך שהכיפה של בית הכנסת קורסת לתוך בית הכנסת, ובית הכנסת בער, והנאצים הוציאו מבית הכנסת את ספרי התורה, ושרפו אותם בערימה, ואני עם אבא שלי עמדנו שם על שתי בלטות, והסתכלנו על זה, וכשזה נגמר אנחנו עזבנו.
הרגש, זה לא יכול להיות שהגרמנים שאנחנו חיים איתם, שזה יימשך ככה, זה אפיזודה. זו הייתה האווירה. ובאווירה זו גם נכנסו לליל הבדולח ולא תפסו אותו. והוא בא עליהם במהלומה, אני זוכרת, אמא עמדה לבנה ובכתה. מה קרה? אני כן זוכר שהיא טלפנה לחברים לא יהודים. היו לה יותר חברים לא יהודים מאשר יהודים. שום תשובה. אף אחד לא.
All right, enough of this.
Now, one of her friends picked up the phone.
I got only pictures, and I was.
Oh,
hit
hold
for
on
the
a second.
speech.
I have to
For
stop.
what?
I have to. Ben Chen.
So where does this fit? Like, is there a strategy here on the German side?
Well, I began by saying I wasn't going to get into sort of, I'm not a poli-sci PhD,
Well,
so
just-
it's hard.
I mean, because when you think of the way that this was received, it does seem so. The guy says it was a blow, right? I mean, I could see how it could feel. I mean, even though things were already bad, like it was just, you know, a one-off, or that, you know, things would get better.
That's
you
what he
know?
says. They thought I mean, the image of his mother, pale and crying with none of her friends answering the phone. I mean, it was beyond imagination. Lisa?
So not so long ago here in the democratic country we live in, people walked in the streets shouting, "Jews will not replace us." It got a little attention. In the city we live in here, Mani Yakutiel's business was graffitoed with Nazi pigs. I didn't see much reaction, and none of my Gentile friends have said to me, "Gee, you must feel horrible." So
maybe the circumstances are not so different today, and maybe human psychology remains the same, Ben. And
Well,
that
there's
evil
a
exists,
significant
and you want to understand it, but it can't be understood.
No, but I'm saying still there's, I think, a significant difference between mobs of civilians engaged in anti-Semitic acts and one's own government destroying the property of its citizens. I mean, that's, you know, they're both alarming, right? But one is different in kind than the other.
I want to show one large testimony. I want to show one 9.5-minute testimony here, and then I want to come back because it, I think, speaks to a lot of what we are talking about here. And she describes the events of Kristallnacht. And it's a long piece, so I'm going to let it run because I wouldn't have the audacity to cut it.
Do you recall Kristallnacht?
That is one of my most vivid memories. As I said, school was right next to the synagogue, and I remember that the maid came in. I guess we still had a maid in those days. Maybe it was an older person. She came in and said, the synagogue is burning. And this was November 10th. And I, you know, got up and got dressed and said, well, you know, I don't believe it, and whatever it was. Though we had heard that you know, this assassination had occurred in Paris.
Are you referring to Herschel Greenspan?
That's right, yeah. But of course, the whole thing had been organized by the Nazis to have this reaction throughout all of Germany. I mean, this was quite obvious. But we didn't know that. We thought, you know, somebody had just started to burn our synagogue. And my father said, well, I'll come with you just to make sure you're all right. And he and I and my friend, we had the same, she lived next door and we went to school together. We went just to where the school had been, and of course the synagogue was burning, and the firemen stood by and watched it and mainly protected the houses around it. And my father told us to go home immediately, and he ran to notify the rabbi, who of course knew about this. I mean, we were so naive that my father must have thought, well, you know, I better tell the rabbi about the rabbi knew about it. But he ran, and I remember people jeering because my father was running, and it worried me. I thought somebody was going to do something to him. Well, my father actually, when he got through with the rabbi, he went to Frankfurt, which was the nearest big town, still is the nearest big town, but the town where there was an American consulate, and at that point got the visa number for my grandparents, because he realized this was the end. This was the beginning of the absolute end. In Frankfurt, they were arresting people on the streets. Fortunately, they didn't know my father, so my father came home, you know, all in one piece for the time being. So we were just sitting at home. It was my grandfather's 77th birthday, and we were going to have a little family supper. And I remember distinctly distracting myself by decorating a potato salad. And of course, we were all sort of sitting together and you know, trembling. And I remember the crowds of school children who were being led out of school for the occasion, walking around, throwing things, invading homes, throwing things out of, looting, throwing furniture out of the windows, you know, cracking the windows, just unspeakable, you know, invasions of people's private homes and stores also, Jewish stores, stores owned by Jews. And the miracle was that my grandparents' home and my parents' home were not hurt. But I still have a visceral reaction to mob noise and crashing crystal. I mean, it's just never left me. when I later on went to my grandparents' house, I saw part of the mob coming on the other side, or on the same side, and I crossed over and, quickly walked the other way. But, well, I told you about how we listened to the radio that night and to see what the foreign radio would say. And they were reporting it, but they were, and then we realized it was taking place all over Germany, of course. After my father came home from Frankfurt, he had seen it in Frankfurt, and we suddenly realized that it was totally organized and was taking place all over the place. And the next day was a Friday, and on Friday nights we always went to my grandparents for dinner and Shabbat. And now I have to say a few words about my grandmother. My grandmother had 3 sons, and 2 of them were killed in the First World War. So my father was the only survivor. She never got over this, of course. She and my father were very, very close. And to get back to what happened the next day, the famous knock on the door, and the Gestapo was there and said to my father to come along. So my father threw a few things in a suitcase and came and wrote on the back of an English language, a teaching book, notify the cousins in America immediately, that, whatever they can do, this is no more time to say depression or what have you in America, we've got to have a way of getting out of this country immediately. And they took him along. So this was just before supper time on a Friday night. And I said to my mother, what are we going to tell the grandparents? We were practically on our way to the grandparents to have supper with them. And I've told you about my grandmother. My grandfather had a heart ailment for years. And my mother says, nothing we can do but tell them the truth. We have to tell them, So we went there, and we told my grandparents, and my grandmother put on her hat. This is the difficult part. And she said, we go to the Gestapo. So my grandmother, my grandfather, she said to my grandfather, komm, Schatz, wir gehen auf die Gestapo. Which Schatz means treasure. She always called my grandfather that. So my grandparents and my mother and I and the little brown dachshund went to the Gestapo, which was not very far away, the building of the Gestapo. And my grandmother said, let me handle this. She went in, and it seemed ages until she came back out, but she did go back out. And she said, it's all right, they're going to release him. And we said, what did you say? And she said, I told them I gave 2 sons for my country. I demand. She went to the Gestapo, and I demand my 3rd one back. And they said, so I'd forgotten, er kommt. And we had gone just a few paces, and he actually followed us home. And immediately took to his bed, and he said, anybody comes, I'm sick. But she actually saved him because he wouldn't have survived in the concentration camp. And Frank's father went to concentration camp and never talked about it. And, my father was a very gentle person and very righteous, and would just not have made it. And so then we suddenly had an invasion of people whose homes had been destroyed. My aunt and uncle, cousin, relatives, strangers. I mean, we took people in, they were all over the house because they had no place to go, and we had a functioning household. So I remember several people, I mean, aside from relatives who came to be with us, and stayed with us as long as was as long as they had to, and so that was basically my experience of Kristallnacht. I mean, I know that the Jews had to go and clean up their own the mess that other people had made of their homes and of their stores, and then were fined. In addition to that, that was the law, the Nazi law.
Steve, you have your hand.
Yes. I think one lesson that a lot of people don't want to think about, but I think about all the time that came out of this, and it relates to what a number of people have said on the call, is you had all these people in Germany thinking, well, we found the promised land in Germany. What do we need a homeland for in Palestine? And that was the thinking then. And so when the Arabs were united and put pressure on the British to close the door to immigration into Palestine, there was no corresponding Jewish pressure to keep it open. And so that door was closed, which sentenced hundreds of thousands of Jews who wanted to go to Palestine to death. And the lesson for today is, you hear from a lot of Jews, we found paradise in America. Who cares about a Jewish homeland in the Middle East? And you think about that, and it's easy to see how we could get diluted, which gets back to Ben's comment. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow progression. The Nazi movement, anti-Semitic hatred started in the 1920s, but no one stopped it. It was allowed to grow. It was a natural progression.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. In fact, on December 1st, Sandy Edwards, who is on our Centennial Committee, is preparing an event with Fred Rosenbaum, who is the foremost scholar of San Francisco Jewry. And I'm going to be in dialogue with him on December 1st for our first of a number of Centennial events this year. And we're going to talk about how the San Francisco Jewish community responded to Kristallnacht and to the Shoah and to the establishment of the State of Israel. And in 1943, the rabbi at Emmanuel, Israel Reichert, was on the forefront of the largest group of Jews against the establishment of the State of Israel. And it was our rabbi of blessed memory, Saul White, who came out very strongly against him and for awareness of what was going on in Germany and with the Nazis, and vociferous support for the establishment of the State of Israel. And ultimately, Emmanuel came along, as did a lot of Jews in this country. Judah.
I was going to say something and I decided not to. And then when Stephen said, it's like, I grew up with the understanding that German Jews were the best Jews, and I'm not German, but they were the most enlightened. They were the creme de the creme of Jews. And I mean, I had a friend in college who was from West 86th Street, ethical culture, Fieldston, the whole hoity-toity stuff, who was German Jewish. And she told me just a few years ago, after she buried her parents, she found out they were actually Ukrainians, but they just pretended to be Germans. So, I'm just thinking, luckily I'm a Litvak, I'm Lithuanian, but just thinking that in the 1880s and 1890s, my grandparents and hundreds and millions, it was just a pogrom that, made them realize it was time to leave. I mean, the Nuremberg Laws, that should have opened people's eyes, years before Kristallnacht. you know, and in Eastern Europe, it just took the pogroms to make them realize we're not welcome here, you know, and it's time to move on. And yeah, granted, I don't know if the quotas were different, you know, to come to America. But I also think, you know, in America today, I don't think, I can't really see the comparison. I mean, I love America, and you know, to me, it's not America or Israel. But I think maybe back then it was Germany. It wasn't a question of leaving. They just, you know, weren't going to leave until they really had no choice.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Judah. Other thoughts? Sandy.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts, but my grandparents and mother in Hamburg stayed until they left in 1939 after the war had started. And my grandmother got my grandfather out of the concentration camp after Kristallnacht with a visa to Colombia, South America. But she did not want to go to Colombia. She wanted to come to the United States. And her sister was able to get her an affidavit. So they came to New York. A lot of the Jews went to Shanghai, the German Jews, because they couldn't get into the United States. So they went east. And the rabbi, I'm just blanking on his name all of a sudden, his very famous Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach's uncle was the chief rabbi in Hamburg, and he did not leave. He sent his family out to England, but he did not leave. He wanted to wait till the last Jew was out of Hamburg safely. And of course, he perished. But that, you know, by that time, everybody was leaving the ship. It was, you know, it was clear. But I mean, it's hard to believe these stories.
I was in a conversation with a rabbi, and we were talking about the essential requirement of Kol Yisrael Arvim Ze B'Zeh, which we were all responsible for each other as Jews. And he was talking about these war years, how the German Jews did look after the other Jews, except they sent them to chicken coops in Petaluma. So they looked after them, but they shipped them up to Petaluma so that they could work on the chicken coops. So there was this sort of understanding that we have to take care of them. But right, Sandy, not in our neighborhood, maybe.
Right. Well, unless you had, you had means of some sort. But I would say the Eureka Benevolence Society, which is the precursor to Jewish Family and Children's Services, they did a lot of good work with the refugees that were coming in. So,
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's just very hard to understand. Sometimes Jewish hard-heartedness around refugees is challenging to understand in light of our history. Randy.
Yeah, I've been listening very carefully to what's been said. Almost all the information that was imparted by the righteous survivors was totally shocking. I think what we're not addressing is we're not talking about the idea of race and how the idea of race is so different in our society now than it was back in the 20s and 30s and 40s.
Can you explain that? Explain that, Randy.
Well, there just was a feeling among many Americans that race was important in driving our society. So there wasn't as much attention to democratic actions then as there was now. There's more of a, I think now in the United States, although there certainly is terrible racism, there are predominant ideologies which are able to help people understand society in a different way. I think what we all fail to understand is how the racial laws in Germany at the time were singular. There wasn't any possibility to dissent from the racial laws in Nazi Germany. They were mandatory, and they were mandatory. So I think we have in our own society, we have the ability to judge what's taken place in a more civilian and culture.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It might be hard for, if we grew up in a liberal democracy without those clear, distinct lines between races, might be hard to place ourselves back 80 years ago. Ellen.
I think it's important to share my own experience about all of this. I was born in 1946, and as many of you know, I grew up in an extremely Reformed Jewish family in New Orleans. And many of my ancestors had already been in the United States for 2 generations. And it's only recently that it occurred to me that we never got to the Second World War in history class, ever, the whole way through high school. And it suddenly occurred to me that it's probably because they didn't want to discuss the Holocaust. It never was discussed in my family. I remember the movie Exodus coming out, and this hunk Paul Newman playing this great lead role. And so I read the book, and when I read the book, that was when I understood what that ship was about. I had no clue about any of this stuff. And I'm a great believer in the saying that those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. I just think it's amazing how many of us never even knew about any of this stuff. My father served in the Second World War, and I do genealogy. And at one point, I did an extensive interview with him about his military service. And my father was somebody who would talk about things in broad strokes. And so I'd have to keep going back and say, well, what did you mean by that? What does that mean? And at one point he told me, Ellen, nobody's going to care about this junk. And I kept telling him, somebody will care about this stuff. But it was only then that he mentioned to me that he had seen Auschwitz during the war, and that he saw those trains, and he knew what that was all about. And that's the first mention I ever heard anyone in my family make about the Holocaust.
Thank you, Ellen, for sharing your story. Are there other thoughts? I have more. I have another video I was going to show, but I didn't want to. Does anyone know The Hangman by Maurice Ogden? Anyone familiar with that? Okay, good. All right, so we're gonna watch a video now. It's a parable.
Into our town, the hangman came, smelling of gold and blood and flame. And he paced our bricks with a diffident air. and built his frame on the courthouse square. The scaffold stood by the courthouse side, only as wide as the door was wide. A frame as tall, or little more, than the capping sill of the courthouse door. And we wondered, whenever we had the time, who the criminal, what the crime the hangman judged, with a yellow twist of knotted hemp in his busy fist. And innocent though we were, with dread we passed those eyes of buckshot lead. Till one cried, "Hangman, who is he for whom you raised the gallows tree?" Then a twinkle grew in the buckshot eye, and he gave us a riddle instead of reply. "He who serves me best," said he, "shall earn the rope on the gallows tree." And he stepped down and laid his hand on a man who came from another land. And we breathed again, for another's grief at the hangman's hand was our relief. And the gallows frame on the courthouse lawn by tomorrow's sun would be struck and gone. So we gave him way. And no one spoke out of respect for his hangman's cloak. The next day's sun looked mildly down on roof and street in our quiet town, and stark and black in the morning air, the gallows tree on the courthouse square. And the hangman stood at his usual stand with a yellow hemp in his busy hand, with his buckshot eye and his jaw like a pike, and his air so knowing and businesslike. And we cried, "Hangman, have you not done yesterday with the alien one?" Then we fell silent and stood amazed. Oh, not for him was the gallows raised. He laughed a laugh as he looked at us. "Did you think I'd gone to all this fuss to hang one man? That's the thing I do to stretch the rope when the rope is new." Above our silence, a voice cried, "Shame!" And into our midst, the hangman came to that man's place. "Do you hold," said he, "with him that was meet for the gallows tree?" And he laid his hand on that one's arm, and we shrank back in quick alarm. And we gave him way, and no one spoke, out of the fear of his hangman's cloak. That night, we saw with dread surprise, the hangman's scaffold had grown in size. Fed by the blood beneath the chute, the gallows tree had taken root, now as wide, or a little more, than the steps that led to the courthouse door, as tall as the writing, or nearly as tall, halfway up on the courthouse wall. The third he took, we had all heard tell, was a usurer and infidel. "And what," said the hangman, "have you to do with the gallows bound?" And he a Jew. And we cried out, "Is this one he who has served you well and faithfully?" The hangman smiled. "It's a clever scheme to try the strength of the gallows beam." The fourth man's dark, accusing song had scratched our comfort hard and long. "And what concern," he gave us back, "have you for the doomed and black, the fifth, the sixth?" And we cried again, Hangman, is this the man? It's a trick, he said, that we hangmen know for easing the trap when the trap springs slow. And so we ceased and asked no more, as the hangman tallied his bloody score. And sun by sun, and night by night, the gallows grew to monstrous height. The wings of the scaffold opened wide, till they covered the square from side to side. And the monster crossbeam, looking down, cast its shadow across the town. Then, through the town, the hangman came and called in the empty streets my name. And I looked at the gallows soaring tall and thought, there's no one left at all for hanging. And so he calls to me to help pull down the gallows tree. And I went out with right good hope to the hangman's tree and the hangman's rope. He smiled at me as I came down to the courthouse square, through the silent town, and supple and stretched in his busy hand was the yellow twist of the hempen strand, and he whistled his tune as he tried the trap, and it sprang down with a ready snap, and then, with a smile of awful command, and he laid his hand upon my hand. You tricked me, hangman, I shouted then. That your scaffold was built for other men, and I no henchman of yours, I cried. You lied to me, hangman. Foully lied. Then a twinkle grew in the buckshot eye. Lied to you? Tricked you, he said. Not I. For I answered straight. I told you true. The scaffold was raised for none but you. For who has served more faithfully than you? With your coward's hope, said he. And where are the others that might have stood side by your side in the common good? Dead, I answered, and amiably, murdered, the hangman corrected me. First the alien, then the Jew. I did no more than you let me do. Beneath the beam that blocked the sky, none had stood so alone as I. And the hangman strapped me, and no voice there cried, stay, for me in the empty square.
So a couple of questions. Anybody, well, I have some thoughts on this. Anybody want to give some reflections on the hangman or the choices made by those involved? Perhaps, you know, there's the famous line from Martin and Niemöller. After the war, he is believed to say, in Germany, the Nazis came for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time there was no one left to speak up for me. Curious how your reflections on these lessons that come from these works from this time period. Judah.
Yeah, there's many ways to kill people, but scaffolding, and especially with the history of America, holds a lot of charge. And ironically, when I moved from San Francisco 10 years ago, I moved to Placerville, which is known as Hangtown. And on the main street, they have a scaffolding with a body hanging from it. And it's a scaffolding as in the city seal. Needless to say, it's redneck country, Placerville. I lasted 2 years there. But this past year they had, there was a movement to remove the scaffolding from Main Street and to remove it from the government, symbol. And I think they were successful partially, but of course, there was a very loud and vocal contingent who, man, they wanted their scaffolding to remain. They just love their scaffolding.
Yeah. Is there a way to stop the hangman? In this story? Yeah. I see some heads shaking. Merrill says yes. Stevens says no. Steve.
Yes. Again, it just reminds me, this great book on the rise of Hitler, that for years his object was not to kill the Jews, just to get them out of Germany. And he learned to his dismay that no one else wanted him. And that's when they changed their policy. And so when people talk about the Holocaust, to me, it was a team effort that we don't want to admit, but it was a team effort, that people did not rise up against the Nazis when they had a chance to. And they were participants by shutting their doors to Jews and not speaking up against what was going on. They allowed it to take place. And
you're not returning the phone calls, not returning your phone calls from your friends for Jews overnight. I mean, treating another person as if they're not a human being created in the divine image. When you lose sight of that, that's where evil steps in. Don.
Yeah. So I'm confused. So it seems like it's about standing up for other people, for oppressed people overall. And since there's so many oppressed people in this world right now, I mean, just all over the place. I walk outside, they're homeless. There's like oppression all over the place. As an individual, me, or I'm asking what, I don't know. I'm just saying, I don't know how you stand for all injustices in the world, or do you just stand for those, like maybe if you're a Jew, for the Jews or whatever, you pick your particular group, or what do you do? Because I in my mind, I'm just saying, I can't, I mean, there's all kinds of groups out there that are being oppressed that I'm not standing for. Okay, so I'm confused and depressed and like, what do we do with this? Is my question. As an individual.
I mean, I think that's the question that society has been trying to answer for 83 years. I mean, I think, what do we do with the presence of evil? What do we do after the Holocaust? How do we understand that there's a God after the Holocaust? How can we understand that people are good after the Holocaust? How do we not sink into total, depression or nihilism? I think that that's the great challenge. I think that's the challenge of our people. I don't think that's a different challenge than we've had for the last 3,000 years. I think it's the same challenge. I just think it became very pronounced. My approach is Confucian. My approach is try to care for those in your immediate circle, and then expand beyond your immediate circle to your neighborhood, and then expand beyond your neighborhood to your city. I think that local, caring for the neighbor who's homeless, who is next to where you live, as opposed to trying to solve some problem on the other side of the world, is my advice. But it can become overwhelming. And that overwhelmingness, I think, a catchphrase in Jewish life of the past generation is tikkun olam. But I hear tikkun olam and I become overwhelmed like you, Don. I don't know how to repair the whole world. And so as a catchphrase, it's very daunting. And I know it resonates a lot in terms of there are broken pieces and shards everywhere that we have to piece back together. But I hear olam, that becomes very hard. If I hear, tikkun CBS, okay, fine. If I can do tikkun my own house, okay, fine. If I can tikkun my own block, my relationship, I think that's the only tachlis way, tangible way to just put one foot in front of the next. All right, 3 final comments. Thank you, Don. 3 final, and then we're going to close because we're over. So Stuart, Meryl, and then Lisa will close us out.
Somebody mentioned the Charlottesville and the
yes,
I'll replace you. There is a trial now. A group has filed suit against those who led the march. Trial is going on now, and Deborah was one of the witnesses.
Lipstadt.
No last name, right? Deborah Lipstadt. She was among the witnesses, and you go after them. You don't let them slide.
You can't let hate foment. You can't let hate foment. It's like Brandeis said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. You have to bring this stuff to light. Thank you. Meryl?
You brought in Deborah, and Deborah talked about the anti-Semitism and put it into perspective.
Thank you. Mom, you're muted.
I think you're right on point when you're talking about your circle locally, because even if we apply that to the Holocaust, which was so overwhelming, I mean, Hitler and his henchmen and the Germans had the grand plan, but it was the local people who carried it out. The Polish police, the civilians, the people in every country who spied on their neighbors and turned themselves in. And on the other hand, the righteous Gentiles and the others and the resistors who saved people, who smuggled children, you think of, like, what did it take, to make those trains run to go and arrest people? Yeah, individuals made a difference, but I mean, this is, I guess a pipe dream, but if everybody really didn't look the other way or didn't contribute when they saw evil in the world in their little sphere, I'm an optimist. I'd like to think that it would make a difference.
I think that's good to rely on the optimism, but I think people don't see it. I think people really have a hard time seeing it. And our prophet Isaiah talks about it. People have a hard time seeing it. We have a blinder on. It's very hard for those of us who are decent, good people. It's just really hard for us to understand the type of evil that we're talking about here. Lisa, you have the last word. Unmute yourself, though.
Very briefly about the overwhelmingness of Tikkun Olam, the rabbis of the Talmud tell us it is not ours to complete the task, only to take it up. The smallest thing you can do is better than nothing.
Amen. And let's end with that. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Lisa, and for everyone who shared their personal stories on this 83 days since Kristallnacht. I think it's an important conversation for us to continue to have. So thank you to all of us. And I'm again blessed to continue to have a space like this where we can talk about it with the type of seriousness and depth that all of you bring to this conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take
Thank you
care.
very much. Thank you.